Thanks again for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Hello, I'm Stephen Willis from the Locked On Ole Miss podcast, and I'm joined by Locked On's recruiting guru, Brian Smith. Just want to let you know before we get started, LinkedIn is the college football recruiting sponsor across the Locked On Podcast Network. LinkedIn helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. Now, Brian, before we get started on defensive line candidates, it just came through X or Twitter or whatever they're calling it this week, that Akylin Dear has visited Ole Miss today, or Thursday, I should say, for practice. I mean, he's been to Ole Miss fairly consistently this spring. I think Ole Miss is in a really good shape for this young man.
That's a kid they've been targeting for a long time. He's from Quitman, Mississippi, so they should. I've said it before on this show and others. I think he's the best running back prospect in the class of 25, regardless of state. And he's a guy that can make an impact wherever he goes from pretty much the first fall camp he's in onward. So electric football player, man. That's big news for the Rebs.
So let's change the subject just a little bit. We're going to talk about defensive line today and some defensive line candidates. What are some of the names that you've heard on the defensive line that Ole Miss fans should keep an eye on?
Well, the two that I constantly hear are obviously Maddox and Oatis, and there are a gazillion other guys. Those are the two in-state kids that ironically play right down the street from each other, two different schools in Hattiesburg. Small world there. But looking at it, I was going over a bunch of stuff over the last couple hours. Like, I'm curious to see how many different guys they get on campus for OVs this summer, because it is a hodgepodge, because they're not shying away. They're going after kids in Alabama. They're going after kids in Mississippi, Tennessee, Florida, all over. The names the kids are going to get for OVs, I'm not sure. But I like two things. Number one, they're not ruling out JUCO kids, and they're going for big fish. Ole Miss has always talked about, like, their fan base, we're eventually going to get to the Alabama level and all that. Well, it's one thing to get Maddox and stuff like that in state. Cool. You got to still get some kids out of state too. And just kind of going through the list, they're all over the place, man. And it's finally that way. To, like with Lane, you knew that would be that way with quarterback. But defensively, like, it's insane too. So good for them. And it's better that they have a variety of options, because I've been to their campus, and obviously you're very familiar with it. It's not that hard to sell Ole Miss on a Saturday. It's a pretty cool place.
No, if they come to an OV and they go to a game on the Saturday and they see the Grove and the atmosphere in the stadium, they do a fantastic job on game day right now at Ole Miss.
Yeah, like I'm looking up to like the visit list and stuff. They've got kids from all over the country. There's a couple kids from Maryland they're trying to get. There are kids from like Texas and all over the place. They've offered a defensive lineman from Illinois. It's wild. And when I think of Ole Miss recruiting traditionally, we just don't talk about that. So good for them. They've got a lot of time between now and the end of June, which is pretty much the culmination of recruiting season with the visits, to figure it out. But don't be surprised if it's a little broader than what Ole Miss fans are expecting.
Yeah, and I think Senquez Golson said it best about 10 years ago. He said, if you don't want to go to Ole Miss, don't visit.
That's a really cool. It's a really cool way to look at it. I think it's a cool college town. I think it's one of my favorite in the country. And I've been blessed to go to a lot, but that's a cool place, man.
Well, you talked about Kevin Oatis and Andrew Maddox. Right down the street, Maddox goes to Oak Grove. Oatis is at Hattiesburg. It's about, 5 miles probably from one school to the other. You could walk there in a short period of time if you wanted to. But let's just say that Ole Miss has a chance to get only one of these two players. Now, we're not saying that Ole Miss is only going to get one of those players. Andrew Maddox's brother, Anthony, AJ, is at Ole Miss right now as a quarterback. But let's just say, hypothetically, in a perfect world, you can only get one of these two guys. Which direction are you leaning and why?
It depends on your defense, but like, especially if you're running a 4-3, it's Maddox, because he's the penetrator, quick off the ball. Like, his foot speed is tremendous. Kevin is a guy I like because he's very traditional and he's just raw, unadulterated power. I've really pushed some of my brethren to rank him higher. Like Garcia from Rivals has got Maddox is a borderline 5-star recruit for Rivals, but I think they're both top 100 kids, and I think both of them can play in a 3-4 or 4-3 in some capacity. But I like Kevin in the more 2-gap scheme, and I like big Mr. Maddox more in a 1-gap scheme.
Now, with Pete Golding, his defenses, he kind of mixes and matches based on the personnel he's playing against. He could be up in an odd front, or he could be up in an even front, all depending on what the offense can do. Do you see a situation where Pete Golding, with the addition of Princely Emmanuel and Walter Nolan to add with JJ Pegues and Jared Ivey, that they're more even front 4-man based and just kind of turning people loose on the edge, like Princely Emmanuel being a Will Anderson type player?
Well, you could be a guy that could but their size, they could play some nose guard, like straight up zero technique, and you could do a couple different guys standing up. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And mixing it up week to week makes it more difficult for the opposition to know what they need to prepare for. When you run just a straight, this is what we do kind of defense, it's a little easier. I mean, Iowa does that and they still do a great job, but they're kind of the exception, not the rule. Even Saban mixed up some of his defenses the last couple of years because they're, a traditional 2-gap scheme. You have to mix it up as good as the quarterbacks are. And I think Pete will do that because he's got more pieces to do it with. And you got to be realistic. Guys are going to get banged up. Somebody's going to be out that's a key piece. You may need to be versatile. So I think they can play even or odd. And it really wouldn't matter if it's a 4-3 or 3-4 front. And they could even run some double eagle, meaning 2 stand-up guys. Think back to the 21 title game, Alabama versus Georgia. They knew they weren't going to beat Bama unless they got to Bryce Young. They just blitzed the crap out of him. Mm-hmm. So you could do some of that too. They got guys that are good enough to be on each edge and just come after a quarterback and with the 3-man line. So adding size has helped them, but they got some athletes too. Like getting Princely is a huge deal because if he's put with the right pieces, and I believe he is, you're talking about a guy that can approach 10 sacks. He's physically gifted enough to do that.
If you look at it, another thing is, during spring practice this year, TJ Dudley and Centarian Perkins, they're still getting reps at defensive end. So Pete Golding's obviously planning on getting into his bag with these athletes because both of them can be tremendous linebackers, but I think they're going to move Perkins around.
If you don't move Perkins around, you're doing yourself and him a disservice, as well as Ole Miss fans. That's just a fun guy to watch. You and I have talked about him a million times. And if I'm not saying this is going to transpire, you could put him at running back for a couple of weeks, get him in the habit of it again. He would at least be adequate as a running back. He's just a good athlete. So if you want to put him outside on 3rd down and 6, act like he's going to blitz and then drop him in the flat looking to get a pick, he's good enough to take it to the house. You want to just blitz him out of the middle linebacker spot and run some different stunts with it, you can do that as well. He's very versatile. And now it's just how much does he pick up? Stephen, you know that as well as I do. These coaches would love to give them more, but sometimes less is better. You don't want to overthink it. And they're going to be so good up front now because of their additions for the portal. They need to focus on a couple of key things and then just adjust against the elite teams more often than not. Give the Alabamas of the world something to think about, that kind of level of play. So,
yeah, the portal and high school recruiting, we always like to talk about that, but Ole Miss had some additions for the 2024 year, the traditional JUCO route. Now, I tell people all the time on my show that 10, 15 years ago, these players were the norm. There would always be a player in a Mississippi JUCO that was playing cornerback or middle linebacker that would go to the D1 level and show out. And it honestly wasn't that much of a surprise. But with the transfer portal and everything's going on, the JUCO is getting pushed further and further down so that people see a JUCO signee and they just assume that these guys can't play. Well, this isn't the case with Cedrick Beavers and Raymond Collins. And with Cedrick Beavers, honestly, I see a little bit of Fred Smoot in his game.
He's got length. He's got the ability to play the ball in the air in the 50-50. And he's an athlete in general. Like he probably could have been a running back or a receiver as well, but he's just got the mentality to play on the defensive side of the ball. And anytime you can get bigger corners, guys that got some size to them a couple of years out of high school, it helps. We both know that the weight room is everything. If you don't have the power to take on a blocker on a screen, well, that screen might just go 75 yards for a score on the first play of a drive. So you need to figure that out. Lastly, look, this league is full of big time receivers. You just can't have enough corners, period. So yeah, it's important to keep that kind of flow coming in, JUCO or otherwise.
Yeah, and Ole Miss also got the #1 junior college linebacker, also out of Jones County Junior College. Man, that defense must have been just hell a year ago. But Raymond Collins, linebacker, he is that guy that 5 years ago Nick Saban would have signed. It'd have been completely surprised. Nobody would talk about him, and he'd end up a starter-type player just wrecking stuff at the linebacker position.
Yeah, he's got the size to play in a 3-4 or 4-3. They moved him around quite a bit, and he didn't disappoint as an edge guy, making a guy miss with a quick inside move as a blitzer, and he didn't disappoint with a guy that shot a gap, being the middle linebacker and recognizing something and beating the guard to the spot. Like, he's an instinctive, athletic football player that can lay a lick. That he reminds me of 1995, but with a little more speed than some of those guys had. This kid's going to play early well, it wouldn't matter which school he went to, but Ole Miss will be the benefactor.
And he can also go sideline to sideline. That's the other thing you notice on that video. He has no you're not beating that guy to the corner.
Yeah, you got to have some of that in today's game because these screens and all this stuff, your running backs and your receivers, all of them are fast. You got to have linebackers that can match it.
Thanks again for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Brian Smith, the Florida football scout. What have you got going on this week, buddy?
Just trying to finish up with some stuff with Auburn's practice. They got a long way to go. And trying to project out on some of these other teams in the South, like quarterback battles and all that. Just talking about it on YouTube and Twitter and stuff. So you can find me at FBScout_Florida. A lot of offers going out too with visits. Like you mentioned earlier, Akylin Dear. We're going to see a bunch of these kids announce all their visits between now and the end of this next month, and it's going to be a lot of fun.
All right, take care, bud, and we'll talk to you next week.
All right, take care.